War. War never changes. From skirmishes in the schoolyard to families divided, the Bit Wars were a strange time in gaming history. The battle of Sega versus Nintendo dominated lunchroom discussions and early morning school bus rides. Social circles were created, alliances drawn, and kids who normally would never be seen with you suddenly became brothers and sisters in arms in defense of our favorite consoles. Usually the battles were cordial, but they sometimes turned tense as friends became foes over bites, mascots, and companies. But what was it like back in those days, and more importantly, why did this happen in the first place? Who or what fueled the fire and turned fans into fanatics? And why is this still happening today? Bone up on your console stats and prepare to defend your game of choice to the death as we enlist in the Bit Wars. Starting us off on our journey through the Bit Wars is a brand new friend of the show, Mr. Greg Seward. You may know him as the co-host of Player One podcast. He is an alumnus of the Electronic Gaming Monthly, used to write previews and write reviews, and also served as an editor for a while. He also is the producer of Generation 16, which is a really cool retrospective of the Genesis, one game at a time. It's a really great series of videos if you're a fan of the Genesis or not, you just want to learn a little more. And overall, a really good, fun guy to talk to. We go through the beginnings of the Bit Wars and what they meant to us. We're here to talk a bit about a strange time in games. And I think it's a time that it's never ended. But as a fan of the 16-bit era, you're probably well aware of the Bit Wars and kind of that battle between Sega and Nintendo. Were you playing games during that time? Like, where were you during that time, and kind of what was your experience, playing games during the Bit Wars?
Yeah, I mean, I was a sort of hardcore gamer at that point. Like I said before, I've been playing games since the late 70s. We had an Atari 2600 my dad had bought. I have no idea why. He was never into video games, but when we got our NES, my brother and I became a really hardcore gamer. So yes, I was absolutely active at that point. And leading into like 1990, 91, I still had my NES, and I was patiently waiting for my Super Nintendo, as most Nintendo kids were. I had played the TurboGrafx 16 at a friend's place, and I had played the Master System a few times. I borrowed one from another friend, wasn't impressed. So I was like, well, Super Nintendo, that's going to be it. And then three things happened. One was that I found a place in the city where I could rent a Genesis, which was not common back then. Because the Nintendo was so, NES was so ubiquitous, you could get it anywhere. You could rent those games anywhere. You go to the grocery store and rent Nintendo games, right? Like that's it. Right. I don't think people really, especially people who didn't live through like the time, the sort of movie rental and video game rental heyday in like the late 80s. Like we had a corner store. I live in a very suburban area, so we had this corner store that kind of served the area, and even they didn't have movies for rent, but they had Nintendo games for rent.
Wow.
So, and it was like that everywhere, but they were all mom and pop shops, and they only rented out Nintendo because it was so popular. You were making money. But I did find a place finally that I could rent a Genesis. And so I talked my dad into making the $200 deposit on his credit card and rented a Genesis with Forgotten Worlds and Super Monaco GP.
Ooh, okay.
And Forgotten Worlds was great. I was hanging out with a friend and we played through that, and that was fine. I wasn't enamored or anything, but it was fun. But as I mentioned earlier, being a big racing fan, Super Monaco GP was like a revelation. I had never seen a console racer that looked like that and played like that. And I was also a big Formula One fan. So being able to play actual Formula One tracks, and they felt real for a video game console at that point. Plus, you're sort of you had this in the cockpit view, which wasn't common in console racers back then either. There was just a lot to that game that if you really dig into it, there's a ton of depth. So I kind of fell in love with that game. The other thing, obviously, was Sonic the Hedgehog was on the horizon. We were all hearing about it at that point. And, I loved Mario. I was really excited about Mario World, but Sonic looked really cool. The advertising absolutely worked on me. And third was when you started hearing rumblings about the Sega CD coming out. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't crazy about the TurboGrafx 16, but I also spent hours at the mall outside of Radio Shack. I don't know if you have Radio Shack down in the States, but
we do. Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah. So Radio Shack, and they were the supplier of TurboGrafx, at least in Canada.
Okay.
So they always had like Easebook 1 and 2 on demo. It was always running, and that along with PC games, sort of as a kid, these things that were just so out of reach. I would never get, my family was never going to be able to afford them. We didn't even have a computer,
Right.
But I spent a lot of time there because my mom's barbershop was there. So I would go to Radio Shack and just look at all the video games I could never own. So I decided that I was sort of getting into the Genesis, and then the Sega CD was on its way. But then there was also all this talk about Nintendo doing a CD drive as well for the Super Nintendo with Sony.
Right. Yep.
And then if you remember, that all fell through, right? They turned their back on Sony. They went with Philips, and then they dropped Philips, and they finally came out and said, we don't think we're going to go CD. And in the meantime, Sega was full steam ahead with CD. And I really felt like that was the future, and I wanted to be part of it. So that was when I decided I'm going Genesis instead of Super Nintendo.
Gotcha. And did you find that in school, or where again, how old were you during this time?
1990, I would have turned 14.
Okay. So you were still in a school situation where you had friends who were, was it mostly Sega? Was it mostly Nintendo? Where were the battle lines? Who was ahead in that?
Mostly Nintendo by far.
Okay.
And I mean, my best friend, we were friends because I got a Nintendo. He had a Nintendo. He was talking to a mutual friend on the playground when we were in junior high, I think. And I happened to say, they were talking about Zelda 2. They were playing Zelda 2. And I happened to say, I've been playing Zelda 2. And Dave was his name. He turned around and said, so you have a Nintendo? And I said, yeah. And we were like best friends from that point on.
Nice. So it developed a friendship. That's pretty cool. It was kind of like ships in the storm almost. Because that's pretty cool. So it was mostly a Nintendo world. That's interesting. Okay. Did you ever encounter any friction like that, like again in the schoolyard or with friends or with other people of the classmates, of just kind of like friction?
Not really. It was mostly good natured. Like the thing that I found, and it's something that you don't get now, because I know there's still sort of system wars now. I'm not sort of involved in those at this point, because to me the current consoles, when you take the Switch out of the equation, the Series X and the PS5 are kind of interchangeable, and I know people will get angry hearing that, but the games look and play well on both. Back then, like if you got the same game on the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, there were major differences, even if they were made by the same company, right?
Yep.
So there was a lot of I don't remember any particular instance, but there was a lot of Street Fighter 2 plays better on the Genesis. Yeah, but it sounds like crap. There was a lot of those conversations, or like big for me and around my friends here, of course, NHL hockey, EA's NHL hockey. So me being the only Genesis owner among my group of friends, when NHL hockey came out, I became very popular because everybody wanted to play that. And a few people I knew bought a Genesis because of that game. But then, they started coming out on Super Nintendo as well, and they were always better on Genesis. So there was always like a bit of, you're playing the Super Nintendo version? God, that sucks,
Yeah. Next up, Steve Luzader shares his opinions on the Bit Wars, the console wars, and how they all fit together. When you were a kid, were you engaged in the Bit Wars? Were you conscripted into the SNES army and fighting that battle?
I would probably say that I was, and it was The funny thing is I don't really believe that the console wars started until we got to that 16-bit era.
I agree.
Because the thing is there was not this ton of advent of advertising of video games back in that 8-bit area. There were a few loose ads for Nintendo products or Nintendo games, or couple loose ads here, but they weren't really much dealing with each other. It's like, hey, we're here, get our stuff. The other guys over here, hey, we're over here, we'll get our stuff. Then we hit the 16-bit part where we have the SNES and the Genesis. And I'm actually, in my mind, I'm still remembering commercials that I saw on television with, each company putting out advertisements to kind of combat the other guy, usually in some funny or satirical or backhanded kind of way. I remember this old Genesis commercial that actually had this little jingle where it was going like, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. And it still sticks in my head, even to this day. But we didn't, and that's where we first began these console wars. And I think whether or not I was actively or passively enrolled into it, I got into the SNES and I stayed with the SNES, and I just never really had this big need to have, want, or play a Genesis. And again,
Yeah.
I don't know whether it was this sort of, um, you know, passive aggressive advertising making me not want to, or just a genuine feeling like, say, hey, I just love this SNES. What do I need the other guys for? What are they really going to offer me that I don't really have here outside of Sonic the Hedgehog?
Right.
And nothing against Sonic, but it
Yeah.
just wasn't enough to pull me away.
Trust me, I'm interviewing a lot of Sonic fans, and they love themselves some Sonic. Just like I know so many people who love Mario, right? And they speak about Sonic in the same way we speak about Mario. It's very interesting. I always wonder, and I'd love your thoughts on this. Do you think the Bit Wars were just kids being kids, or do you think it was manufactured by Nintendo versus Sega, or a
I
mixture of both?
I think in the beginning that the Bit Wars were a bit manufactured.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the onslaught of advertisements on TV and in the gaming magazines like old Game Pro or whatever it was, you weren't away from it. It was in some form or another kind of always at you. And so I believe initially that it was manufactured by the companies to draw their own crowds and draw the products away. Um, as we got on in the generations and into today, I think that the console wars as they are today are largely fan base manufactured.
Yeah.
I don't think that the companies themselves really give a darn what the other guy's doing. And we see that again because there's a lot of cross-platforming stuff anyways
Sure.
between just titles, and now we're getting more actual cross-platform play in games.
Right.
But Sony doesn't really care what Microsoft is doing. Microsoft doesn't really care what Sony's doing, and Nintendo doesn't care what either of them are doing, and vice versa. I think it's not that the console wars are dead, but the console wars live on in us, the people
Mm.
playing it, and we're seeing that now still a little bit as as we're at the essentially the dawn of the current generation with the PS5 and the Series X. And you've got the Xbox people still trying to hold on to their sacred cows and tell them what they like. They want Gears of War and their Halo Infinite and things like that coming up. And you always hear the Sony fans coming up back with like, yeah, but you guys don't have any real exclusives. You want exclusives, you come play this guy. And that's
Right.
where that comes from. But that's all just amidst the masses. I don't think there's any real bite to it except for just a bunch of gamers just kind of wanting something to feud about a little bit.
Sure. And I think that's just human nature, that piece of it. And that's why I always figure that again, back in the old days, it definitely was kids just being kids, right? Finding identity in a product or in a company or a console. As adults, I think we should all realize that we should never do that. Do not put your identity into companies and consoles because they are
No.
going to let you down. They're not going to fulfill your needs. They're not going to. They're not designed to. Because they don't really care about you. So don't do that. But I definitely think that's just human nature, But I think especially in the 16-bit era when, like you said, Sega had that very aggressive advertising, they kind of went for the throat of Nintendo, like really, intentionally went for the throat. And Nintendo for a while really just said, "Oh, we got Mario, we have Zelda." So
I think a big difference too
yeah,
between then and now here is then we're still looking at video games still kind of trying to get their footing in not just America, but the
sure.
mainstream as well here. We're really only talking 16-bit. I mean, if you go kind of back to the Atari, we're only talking like 3 generations in at this point. And there's still a lot of people that think video games are a fad, that they're just still going to go away at some point in time. It's just like, people just can't dump the time or attention into this. This is just, like
Right.
people will say about television or cars or electricity, it's, oh, this is just a fad. And I still think there was a very heavy mindset of that back then. So the companies had to be a little more aggressive in the ad campaigns to draw the masses in. Now, today, the video game companies are just so entrenched. They're rooted in Americana that they don't have to go play those aggressive tactics. They're like, hey, we're here. We're here. Stop by if you like us.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And they're relying on us and social media to do a lot of that hype generation for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're doing that for them with our conversations, good conversations and not so good conversations, right? There's both different sides of the discourse. We kind of generate that for them too. So no, That's a really good point. Yeah, they were fighting not only for dominance and market share, but they were fighting for relevance back in those days. And just, hey, we're video games, and most kids know who we are, but there's a huge segment, especially parents, who are buying those games for kids that may not. So let's try to catch as many people as possible and kind of generate this want, which is pretty interesting. Next up, Jeff and Trevor from the New Dad Gaming podcast shared their experiences living in a world of two battling systems.
Yeah, the Genesis thing, I don't know if it's a Nintendo kid thing or just a difference between the system and the idea for how the two companies approach things. Because Nintendo was family friendly, family fun. Let's get you into some Mario, throw some Goombas, this will be great. Whereas, Sonic had that edge to him. Mm-hmm. Radical, like this, you can't pin down this hedgehog. So the game was like, much more metal music and difficulty. Like I could never really get into Sonic, which I almost pegged up just because I had been into the Nintendo world so much. So I'm kind of happy to hear you also had difficulty playing those games.
Yeah, I'll throw it to Jeff real quick after this, but for me, Sonic was just I never understood it, like I said, and I just kind of knew my Nintendo, and that's kind of what I knew. And if you all remember too, Genesis came first. Right. Genesis was the first one to come out. I think it came out a year before the SNES, if I'm not mistaken. And I could be wrong. I often am. But yeah, Jeff, what do you feel about that piece of it?
Well, I remember my dad trying to convince me to get a Genesis because he was it's not like he wanted to play Sonic or anything, but he was like just really into the specs, and he's like, the Genesis is more powerful. And I don't know if he was right or not, but I believed him. I'm like, I don't care if it's more powerful. I need Mario. I need Mario and Yoshi, and that's my life. That's what I need to do. So I remember him trying to convince me, and I remember pouting in the store like it's not going to happen. And then I saved up my money and eventually got the SNES. But he was like, no, we should get a Genesis and we should do this. And I'm like, it just doesn't appeal to me.
Interesting.
So It was just something odd. But I will say, like, what's kind of common between those two systems, I remember the change from, like, you remember the NES, you had to load the games in kind of like horizontally and then press down the spring and close it up and boot it up. Yep. Whereas these systems was just like lock and loaded. It was like, you know what I mean? Like you slam it down. It was like loading like a virtual weapon, just like boom, and let's go, let's game, let's do this.
Yeah, chunk. The big old chunky, the purple power button, ka-chunk.
That's right.
Now, we all know Sega and Nintendo battled over tech specs and hardware, but what about software? What about the games themselves? Yes, we all know about Mario versus Sonic. That's a well-traveled road. But what about the games that were the same? Aladdin versus Aladdin. NHL 94 versus NHL 94. Greg returns to the conversation to talk about one game in particular that was a really interesting battleground. As an SNA, for me, it was always in the playground, going back to kind of those bit war, the back and forth. I always focused on the tech specs. Remember, that was a big deal back in those days. How many colors can this move? What the processor speeds were. And because I think at that point, PCs were just starting to become a thing. Because we're talking about 91, 92, like 94, they were getting a little more ubiquitous. I think I had my first PC in like 96. And it was all about the tech specs. That was everything. Which one could push more colors and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, it absolutely was. And I mean, that was, if you were getting into conversation with sort of a Super Nintendo nerd and you were a Genesis nerd, that would always come up, the colors. But I mean, I always found on the Genesis side, you always sort of focus more on gameplay, for better or worse. Like the Street Fighter conversation. I will go to my grave saying that Street Fighter 2 was better on the Genesis than it was on the Super Nintendo. It didn't look better and it didn't sound better, but it played better.
Interesting. I've never played it on Genesis, so I can't speak to it.
For me, it's I think it's because I didn't grow up playing it on the Super Nintendo. I cannot deal with shoulder buttons for a 6-button fighter.
Interesting.
So, yeah,
wow.
I just can't do it. So, and same with Mortal Kombat. Obviously, that was the big argument. Like, Mortal Kombat on the Super Nintendo looked way better than the Genesis. But, of course, on the Genesis, you had the blood and the fatalities. But further than that, if you go really play them, and I think I've seen videos on, I feel so justified or vindicated in this years later when I see videos of people who actually know what they're talking about, breaking down like the Super Nintendo versus Genesis versions of Mortal Kombat and saying like, actually the Genesis version plays closer to the arcade, not just because the fatalities are there, but as far as just the way it feels closer to the arcade. Doesn't look near to it at all, but so it was always sort of that sort of thing. Everything looked prettier on the Super Nintendo, but tended to run a little bit better, and in my opinion, play a little bit better on the Genesis. Not all the time, but that was sort of where your fallback. You couldn't fall back on graphics or sound because it was usually not as good.
And it's interesting because if you're having that conversation with somebody, you can't prove that.
No,
someone has to have it in their hands, right? Like, and here's the control. If you're on a playground, you're going with what you saw in GamePro, right? That's really
especially if they were got different scores. Like that was gospel then.
That's it. It's like that's right. If it had a different smiley face, if you had a red face with like the hair sticking out, then you were that was a classic in the making. No, that's interesting. I never really thought of it that way. I actually most recently, the last time I was at a gaming convention here in Texas, I played Street Fighter, might have been Turbo, I forget which one, but it was on the Genesis, and it had a 3-button controller to use select or start to switch between the two modes. I forget which one it was, and I didn't love it, but I didn't hate it. I kind of was playing like, I could get used to this.
I should, caveat to what I said earlier, you needed the 6-button pad. Please don't take that out of context. I should have said that. I can't play those games with a 3-button pad. No.
It was rough. Rough. But I was playing, I'm like, I could see like any port in the storm, I could probably get used to this. This is not optimal, of course, but okay, I could see someone not hating this.
Yeah.
But you were talking about the 6-button. Okay.
6-button all the way, yeah.
Gotcha. No, this one had a 3-button, which was pretty strange. And again, it was an interesting experience playing it. Much like the Civil War or World War II, it wasn't just the combatants that mattered. Where the battles were fought were just as important. Coming up after this very short break, new friend of the show, Ian, also known as TB on Twitter, chats with me about the places and periodicals where the bullets were actually fired. So you mentioned a little bit about the Genesis, right? We're talking about the Genesis.
Absolutely.
And you were a Nintendo kid in the Sega world.
Yeah.
Thinking back on that era, and it sounds like your experience was actually pretty chill. Here in the States, it was not.
Yeah.
Battle lines were drawn. And if you remember the marketing of the time, and again, I'm not sure how it was in England, which is why I think this is an interesting perspective. Do you feel like there was that kind of contention between like Sega and Nintendo?
Yeah.
Or was it more downplayed
It
in England?
was, I think more than anything, it was a battle that, for my perspective anyway, a battle that wasn't played in the schoolyards, but was played during the commercial breaks of TV shows.
Yeah.
And the adverts that we got over here were really, really something else. I'll have to pass you some YouTube links so you can check these out.
I'd like to.
For the Nintendo games for SNES, we got popular comedian Rick Mail. You might know him as Drop Dead Fred from the movie.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Very, very popular comedian over here. Unfortunately passed away a couple of years back, but at the time he was the face of Nintendo's marketing. And I remember adverts where he was promoting Super Mario All-Stars, Link's Awakening. There was one at Starwing. I think not Star Fox, Starwing over here.
I didn't know it was a difference. Wow,
Yeah,
okay.
they called it Starwing over here for no good reason.
Hi, Rick Mail here. I don't know if you're like me, immensely rich, talented, handsome. Isn't it a bore? Well, I found the answer. Zelda Link's Awakening from Nintendo. You play a medieval elf named Link.
You travel through many worlds, meeting endless characters on your eternal adventures.
So hey, next time you're Rick Mail, why not try Zelda Link's Awakening? I think you'll like it.
Zelda, involving an inexhaustible Nintendo.
But he was the face of Nintendo's adverts, and I love that guy. I think he's probably one of my favourite comedians. And seeing him, promoting my beloved SNES, my beloved Zelda, it's like, yeah, go Rick. But the advertising that we had for the Mega Drive over here was something else. It was just so edgy. And you could see why a lot of people gravitated towards it. Certainly that people of my age that were, 10, 11 at the time, things like that. And these adverts where... There's one that sticks out in my mind where it was a guy walks into a barber shop and asks for the Cyber Razor Cut. At which point the barber goes, yeah, and proceeds to give him some kind of bionic arm to play his Sega games with. The guy then looks at the camera and says, there are lots of Sega games, each one more difficult than the rest. Can you handle it? Something like that. And then this barber became some kind of recurring character in the Sega adverts, and there was the whole song and dance advert, Get the Cyber Razor Cut. God knows what the Cyber Razor Cut was, but everyone seemed to want it.
Oh my god.
I'll have to show you this. But
yeah.
After that, it got very, very pointed towards not so much the 32X, but the Sega CD. Or Mega CD as it is over here. And they started doing these, I can't describe them, something like presenting it like it's pirate TV or illegal transmissions or something, taking over other adverts, kind of like what Terry Crews did in the adverts for Old Spice a few years back, which were fantastic.
Very great. Of course, they're fantastic, yeah.
But I just remember... the only thing I can remember is kind of a skull logo, and at the end of their adverts, it'd shout something very quickly, like Sega TV, something like that, and then disappear. And the whole thing was just very, very, very 90s, very edgy, and even for myself, I'd find myself going around humming, Get the Cyber Razor Cut. I couldn't help it. But that's one thing I do remember, a discussion with one of my former friends in the playground and saying, yeah, we've got the Cyber Razor Cut. What have you got? You've just got Drop Dead Fred. I love Drop Dead Fred. Leave him alone.
Drop Dead Fred's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
That's funny. It's interesting because Sega always did position itself as the edgy adult, console, where Nintendo was the baby console for babies.
It was for families.
It was the family
fun.
console. Right, and Nintendo never really bit back for a while. At least the American was just like, yeah, okay, we're the market leaders. We don't really care until they became, at least in America, not the market leaders, and then they finally had to fight back. It's interesting. I love that, and like, there's a little song. I like the idea of this barber. Like, you can't play Sega games unless you have a mechanically augmented arm. Like, you can't handle it. Like, unless
It really is some kind of Deus Ex kind of looking arm as well.
Yeah, seriously, it's like unless you're unless you're Adam Jensen in Deus Ex, you cannot handle Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Like,
Turning around and looking at the barber going, I didn't ask for this. Yes, I did.
Actually, that's pretty interesting. And so I like that idea that marketing in your world was on TV. It definitely was for us as well. I remember the marketing in the magazines because I wasn't watching as much TV as a kid. I watched some, but I didn't watch a lot. My parents were pretty strict. Yeah, they were pretty strict on what I watched, and a lot of it was cable and things like that. So I didn't really get a chance to watch a lot of TV, but I had 2 magazine subscriptions. I had a Game Pro subscription and a Nintendo Power. You know, I subscribed to both of those, and they were in the magazines. And I remember towards like toward the end of the SNES era, going into like the 32X and Sega CD era, the ads got gross. They just started turning into like gross out ads, and each company just trying to be, again, edgy. I remember very clearly an ad in probably Game Pro or EGM, one of those, where it was a jar of toenails. Ooh. And it was just like this jar of toenails, and then it was, this is more fun than playing such. I gotta look it up now, but it was like gross.
Oh, so it was actually pointed at a rival game or
Oh
something.
yeah. Oh no, they would make fun of the other.
I couldn't even imagine that.
Sega was notorious for sending ads that literally just made fun of Nintendo.
Wow.
Like,
I mean,
full out.
I've seen a few online. Was it James Rolfe from Cinemassacre did his video about Genesis versus Super NES and mentioned some of the TV commercials, and that blew my mind that they'd make such pointed attacks. I mean, the only one I can remember, I mean, when you said gross, I wasn't sure what you meant, whether actually gross out or just kind of, why would you make that kind of thing? I mean, I can only imagine it'd be something like, a jar of eyeballs, and then for no reason at the side saying something like, play Ren and Stimpy. But the one that I do vaguely remember, I think it may have been in a magazine that I picked up at some point. I was very, very fortunate that every time I went out shopping with my granddad, he'd go and buy all the groceries and such, and he'd leave me in the magazine aisle just flicking through, and then he'd come back when he'd finished shopping and say, did you find one you want? And he'd get one for me. It was such a lovely man.
To go back to advertisements in the Bit Wars real quick.
Sorry, the one that I was thinking of, it was in one of the magazines I was flicking through. I think it may have been one of these multi-platform ones that I never really got. I think something like Mean Machines or Games Master, something like that. Okay. And there was one advert towards the back, and I think it was for the Mega Drive. Can't remember exactly, but it just showed a guy playing some kind of video game console. I'm not sure which one it was, and then a woman at the side of him wearing nothing but lingerie, and it just said, I remember a time when he couldn't keep his hands off me.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Oh, that's risque.
Yep. You kind of flick past it real quick, like, ho, ho, ho.
Yeah. Me in the middle of the supermarket going, no, I'm not looking at
that. You're looking like, what aisle am I in? Like, what section? I mean...
Who am I? What year is it?
I'm pretty sure this was the video game section, not adult interests. I'm sure. Yeah, I remember that one. Yeah, that's just the marketing was. I mean, Nintendo and Sega had the famous, Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
Yeah, we didn't have that slogan over here.
Yeah,
I do remember at the end of the Rick Mail Nintendo advertisements, there was always a 3-word slogan. It was always something like, Ninteresting, Ninnovative, Nintendo. But
that's not very good.
Well, it's when the alliteration doesn't roll off your tongue.
No.
But no, I do like the whole Genesis does what Nintendo don't. That is
very clever.
That is very, very smart, and I can appreciate that.
Another one that I was just looking up a few of them is a Genesis ad again, and it's a stack, like a giant stack of Genesis games. Probably 3 columns, maybe 20 games, like 60 games with the Genesis Mega Drive on top of it and a controller. And then next to it is a Super Nintendo with the 2 Super Nintendo controllers, and there's 5 games.
What 5
and it
games?
just says the other guys just don't stack up. Yeah, right? I mean,
I wouldn't be able to narrow my SNES collection down to just 5.
Let me see if I can zoom in and see what 5 games they featured. I'm pretty sure they're featuring the launch library, because the launch library of the SNES was 5 games.
Yeah.
Because it launched in August, and then by holiday there were about 13 or 14. And SimCity is one of them. ActRaiser is another. It's a blurry image. I'm sure I can find a better copy.
Oh, ActRaiser. Love that game.
So good. I'm so glad there's a remaster coming out.
Have you played it?
I have. Oh, is it good?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm so happy that happened.
It's the ActRaiser you remember, except there's some weird little tower defense game in there as well, and I'm not quite sure on that.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's great.
Yeah. Well, that's so because this is actually this Genesis thing, because the Mega Drive was out for a year and a half, I would say, before the SNES. So of course it had 60 games, and the SNES came out with 5. Yeah, because that's what launches are.
Of course. I mean, look at the N64 launch. That was, what was it? Super Mario 64, Pilot Wings, and Shadows of the Empire.
Yep, that's about it.
Yeah,
that's right. That is about it. Yep.
And then Turok a couple of weeks later.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, exactly. So it was interesting again how the battle was on TV for you. That's a very interesting kind of notion.
There was a TV show called Games Master. Absolutely brilliant TV show. It was compulsory viewing every single week. You had to watch it because it would show news, reviews. There'd be tips and tricks sections, and most importantly, there'd be people challenged, like I said earlier about Super Mario Challenge, challenging each other to various games, and if they won, they got the golden joystick as a prize. Everyone wanted a golden joystick. But
Very nice.
Tune in and see people challenging each other on SNES games that I was familiar with, and on Mega Drive games or Amiga games, and okay, these are fantastic. Is this out on Nintendo? Because I want it. That would be the running line. And I seem to remember one week they had a challenge on James Pond RoboCod, and I was just transfixed. He can do that. He can climb on the ceiling. That's incredible. I want that. Is that on Super Nintendo? It is. Yes.
No, that's very cool. I just love how it also kind of invaded so much other media at the time, unlike any other era. Again, you had here in the States we had like Nick Arcade, which was a Nickelodeon show, which was a cable show. That's really, really neat. Next up, Justin from the Baseball and Whatever podcast talks a bit about his experiences on the front lines of the Bit Wars, and also as a teacher reveals to us that these things haven't changed. These skirmishes still exist. And actually, if you spend any time on social media, especially Twitter, where I spend half my life, we're still fighting this battle. So we take a little bit of a dive into why.
Oh yeah, it's funny you bring up the console wars. I forget how crazy it was. Being in grade school and you were either a Genesis kid or a Super Nintendo kid, and
that's it.
That was it. And you'd think that over time, like I feel like as an adult, I've had Xboxes, I've had PlayStations, and I see the value of both, and I understand why people have their favorites. But as a teacher, it cracks me up that this console war thing is still going on, and the amount of arguments I've had to stop in middle school between kids arguing over which should they get, a PS5 or an Xbox Series X. And then of course you always have the kid that's in the corner like, well, I just have a PC and I can play whatever I want. I'm like, yep. You're right. I know. I used to be you when I was a little kid, and I can't afford that anymore. So yeah, but the console wars are still going strong. I can attest to that.
Well, good luck getting a graphics card now, kiddo. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, they're giving me tips on how to get a PS5 added to my cart on Target and what the secrets are. But,
that's so funny.
Yeah,
that's so good. That's really funny. The Bit Wars were a strange time. And here's a quick question for you. Do you think the Bit Wars were fueled by just kids being kids, or do you think it was fueled by companies being companies?
I would have said for the longest time it was just kids being kids. I mean, the amount of times I had heard from somebody on my block, well, my uncle works at Nintendo and this game's never coming to Genesis, still cracks me up. But after reading in for what it's worth, I mean, I know some people really enjoyed the book and other people didn't. But after reading the book Console Wars, that kind of dove a little bit deeper into some of the office dealings in corporate decisions that both Nintendo and Sega made at the time, there was definitely a little bit of a struggle between the two. Like, they were definitely cognizant of what was going on and trying to one-up each other. So after reading that, I kind of realized that it was a little bit of both. Obviously, the kids kind of ran with it and kept it going, but I think there was something to be said for both Nintendo and Sega trying to get the upper hand on each other, for sure.
There's definitely a lot in the marketing, especially in the magazines. If you had a Game Pro or EGM, the marketing was where they waged the battle,
for sure.
Right, and there were commercials and such, but really, I think it was in the magazines.
Wasn't it? Was it Genesis does what Nintendo don't? Was that the marketing slogan?
That was one of those. Yep. And Genesis was always more aggressive, I think, with the marketing.
They were your stereotypical 90s, let's be edgy and lots of flashing lights and bright colors, I feel like, whenever I see old Sega commercials, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I think it was definitely, I think it was a little of both. I think, because just like you said now, kids today, kids and adults today, kids and adults still have their fandoms. And I think a lot of that is spurred by, as adults, we want to think the thing we spent money on is the best option.
Exactly.
That's, I think, a big, big part of it. And I think it's human nature to want to be attracted. It's human nature to want to be attracted to a certain thing or a certain group of people, right?
Exactly.
And with that human nature, it's okay. That's an okay thing to have. But when it gets to be too much, you're too into that thing. When you're like arguing with people online, it's like that's where the problem is.
I feel like when you make that a part of your identity, is with anything, that's kind of when you take it too far. And I feel like it's just one of those constants. I mean, like, every once in a while, I'll still go on GameFAQs, which, I mean, I've been going on there for almost 20 years now. And, it's like, oh, yep, there's another console. This whole console war thing is going to, ramp back up again. And it's kind of funny, but at the same time, it's like, oh man, I hope most of these people aren't, adults getting this amped up and this upset about things, but, to each their own, I suppose.
Yeah, identity is exactly the right term for that. It's when you make something part of your identity, now it becomes unassailable and it's something that cannot be challenged.
Exactly.
And that's hard. And you should never, I've said this before on other shows, you should never put your identity into a corporation.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Because they're going to fail you and always going to fail you at some point. They're designed to fail you.
Right.
Things are designed to break and fail. So
yeah, you're going to hold them up as this end all be all, but then on the flip side, they're looking at you as a data point, and that's about it.
That's about it.
And I feel like with marketing, some of the marketing is getting very persuasive to a certain extent too, where you don't want to be a fan of a brand per se because they know what they're doing, I guess, so.
Right. And I will soften that a bit by saying that the people inside companies will care.
Yes.
I think people do.
Yes.
Especially if there's anyone listening who works for a video game company or any corporation. But the entity itself is not designed to do
exactly.
that.
Exactly.
The entity, the people inside can.
Yes.
Some don't, but some do. I actually work for a corporation, like my real job. I actually work for a company. So I should probably not do those little diversions. I put on my hippie hat and get all wacky. I should stop doing that, but probably won't. I'll learn my lesson eventually. Next up, we have Ian returns to the show. A little context: earlier during the conversation, he was sharing that he was a Nintendo kid in a Sega world. Kind of the opposite of Joey from episode 2. Nintendo kid in a Sega playground. And there was one other girl in his class who played Nintendo. So of course I pressed him a bit on, how that relationship worked, how that kind of all articulated as far as social structure goes. And we go on a nice little divergent on some of the games that made him feel comfortable as that SNES kid living amongst a bunch of Sega fans. So you knew the one girl in your class or grade that had a Game Boy. Did you kind of like cling to each other like ships in the storm? Like we're in this together as Nintendo fans?
No, not really. I think the biggest interaction we ever had was she came up to me one day and said, "Have you played Jackie Chan on the Nintendo?" I'm like, no, sorry, can't help you.
That's about it.
Yeah, I think there was one other kid in, I think it was another class. I'm not sure whether it was younger but I do remember him asking me how to get past a part in Super Mario Brothers 3. And I remember explaining to him how to do it, and then he came back to me the next day. Yeah, that worked. Thanks. But again, we just kind of just assumed, that was a thing. But
interesting.
Not realizing that everyone else was just enjoying their Sonic the Hedgehog at the time.
And it's interesting too because the Mega Drive, because at that point, the SNES wasn't really out yet, so it was really kind of 8-bit versus 16-bit at that era, right?
It was. It was a very, very strange time until the Super Nintendo came along, and that's another thing that I remember quite clearly. I remember telling this one to the Well-Read Mage on MageCast. My cousin, Christian, got a Super Nintendo before I did, and he's a little bit older than me, and he used to bring it over to my house every other night, hook it up so that he could show me Super Mario World and A Link to the Past. And I'll forever thank him for that, because A Link to the Past is my favourite game of all time.
Ooh, interesting. Okay.
I love that game. And seeing what this Super Nintendo could do and thinking, wow, that's got to be something that beats all their Sonic the Hedgehog and Echo the Dolphin and things like that. I think that's the only time I got kind of patriotic about Nintendo.
Where you felt that swell of pride that you'd made the right choice in your mind, maybe? Yeah. Did you ever experience any kind of blowback from Sega kids when they were talking about it? Sounds like everyone was pretty chill about it.
Everyone was pretty chill that I spoke to. That's probably just the circle of friends that I keep. But sure. I think a good friend of mine at the time invited me over to his house, and we used to play some Sega games quite regularly. I remember playing Echo the Dolphin, Marco's Magic Football, which was a fantastic little game. I've actually got that on the Super Nintendo now, so and what's the other one? Oh, Pugsy, which was a very, very strange little physics platformer. And I remember the two of us trying to puzzle through the levels hour after hour after hour, and really, really enjoying that. But the only kind of backlash that I got from any of the Sega kids was when I was around at a different friend's house and we were playing Sensible Soccer on his Mega Drive, and I thought I was doing well until I realised I was scoring own goals and I was 6-0 down. I thought I was 6-0 up. So after that, I'm ashamed to say this, I went out and traded in one of my games, I can't remember which one it was, so that I could get Sensible Soccer on the Super Nintendo so that I could practice.
Sure. Wow, for your competitive your competition.
Absolutely. Right? And I still think Sensible Soccer is one of the best sports games ever. I mean, Mega Drive's famous for its sports games, your Madden, your NHL, NBA, but Sensible Soccer's where it's at. And after hours and hours and hours practicing on that thing, I remember going back to my friend's house and, hey, should we play Sensible Soccer? Nah, I traded it in. No!
No. I like the fact there's a game, and I've never heard of this, maybe it might just be an England thing or not, or maybe I just don't know it. But Sensible Soccer is such a wonderful name for a game. It's like, imagine a game called Adequate Baseball, or
I'd play that.
Good-natured football, right?
Yeah, it's because it's made by Sensible Software, the team that made
okay.
Oh, give me a second, it'll come to me. Cannon Fodder.
Oh, I've heard of that one. Yeah, Cannon Fodder.
Yeah,
that's funny. Oh, that's good. Okay, that makes perfect sense now. Okay.
Yeah.
I just like that name, Sensible Soccer.
The alliteration just rolls off the tongue.
It sure does. It sure does. Next up, Joe Corio makes his triumphant return to the show. It's been a few episodes since we've heard from Mr. Joey, And we circle back on exactly why, and more importantly than why, really, who did it? Who started this skirmish? Who started the Bit War battles? Was it just kids in the playground being kids? Was it companies being companies? Or was it a mixture of both? Let's find out together. And well, since we're talking about the Bit Wars, you remember I was Team Nintendo all the way.
Yes,
all the way. And I distinctly remember a few spirited arguments, a few back and forths between you and I over a couple of battles there along the way during the Bit Wars over console supremacy.
Sure.
What do you think caused that? Do you think that was just us as kids? Because that happens now, right? PlayStation versus Xbox and PC Master Race and all the rest of it. But what do you think caused that? Do you think that was a manufactured thing by the companies themselves, or was that just a natural progression, like a natural progression of just kids being attached to their stuff?
Aggression, passion, adolescence, raging hormones, pettiness, boredom,
all the energy
all
in the world
above.
and nothing. Yeah, all the energy in the world and nothing to use it on.
Right, nowhere to go. Kids, friends jockeying for position. But of course, I mean, marketing too. I mean, the companies caused that. You couldn't watch a video game commercial or pick up an EGM or a Game Pro or any type of video game magazine without them acknowledging each other. The editors, saying, well, this is which is better, I mean, there was reviews and compare contrasts. And I think everyone at that point was painted one color or the other. You were either, again, like you said, you were either Team Sega or Team Nintendo. Right. So I think a lot went into it. Was it manufactured by the companies? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, as we're talking it through, I think it was probably created through kids, but then bolstered or boosted by the companies realizing, wow, there's an actual competition going.
There's energy.
Let's lean into that.
Yes, correct. Yeah, let's play off that. And at the time, like I said, Genesis would, they were ready for the 16-bit wars because they had Konami, they had Midway, they had Capcom, they had the third parties in their pocket. They also did a great job with the first party software. The Shinobi sequel was fantastic. Altered Beast, as I mentioned, Echo the Dolphin. Sure, what a game. Yeah. Just a great game. Their first parties were really, they were done well. Comic Zone, I think it was called. I want to say Comic Zone. That was a great game. And then, of course, their flagship, their mascot, Sonic the Hedgehog. And that's really, it was games like that was able to turn the tide, so to speak, and have Nintendo change the narrative. Like I said, towards the mid to end part of the 16-bit era, where you looked at the Super Nintendo as a sovereign system, and Nintendo did advertise themselves that way. You want to go fart around on Genesis? Go ahead, but this is a sophisticated type of gamer. Ours is a sophisticated type of gamer to play our games, to play Star Fox, to play Link to the Past, to play Super Metroid, to play ActRaiser. If you're a savvy, more adult, more mature gamer, you're going to play our platform.
Yeah, and it's interesting with Donkey Kong Country. I remember with Nintendo Power, I started receiving these VHS tapes that were basically, 15-minute advertisements for whatever game they were promoting. But one of them was for Donkey Kong Country, and in that game, in that video, they were already saying not 32-bit, not 64-bit, 16-bit.
Yeah,
Donkey Kong Country. Like they were already fighting that battle, which is crazy. It was that uphill battle of the Bit Wars. They were still saying already, they were having to say, forget about these fancy new systems, stick with the SNES because we can push Silicon graphics.
Silicon, very good. Yeah, that was it. That was the buzz. Yes, that was the term. Yeah. Very good. Good memory. That was
the buzzword, yeah. And we can do this on a Super Nintendo, the thing you already have. Don't
Yes.
get the other thing. You have this sitting in right now.
Yes.
Of course you do, because you have Nintendo Power, and this is coming with Nintendo Power.
Yeah, right. No, you're right. That was
Yeah.
their slogan. Don't need 32 or 64-bit. Don't need an add-on. Don't need 32X.
Yeah, no add-ons.
Or CD or some sort of Frankenstein-esque peripheral to pair your console with. This is the system that you bought 5-6 years ago, and these are the games that you're able to play.
And finally, Ian returns to the show to share an anecdote about who's fighting this war right now. Spoiler alert, it's kids. Although you do see your fair share of adults doing so online. We'll talk about that. But shares a quick anecdote about kids just being kids in the midst of these kind of skirmishes. And then Greg and I finish off the show with a really good conversation about the state of the wars today and some of the reasons behind that friction.
These days, I'll be honest, I don't have any affiliation with any particular platform. I've got some Nintendo, some PlayStation, some Xbox. But one thing that strikes me, and this might be interesting considering what we're going to talk about, I was talking to some of my students the other day, and they said to me, "Oh, well, what console do you have?" And I said, "Well, I've got them all. You know, I'm a collector. I collect video game consoles." And they started listing them off, ones that they could think of. I'm like, "Yep, got one of them. Yep, got one of them." But they actually said to me, "Yeah, well, which is better, PlayStation 5 or Xbox One?" And I said, "Well, I play my PlayStation more than the other." And they just looked at me and said, "No, wrong choice." I'm like, no, it isn't. There's no wrong choice. They're all great.
They're still fighting the wars. And we're going to talk a bit about that. That kind of the phenomenon almost of that fandom, right?
Yeah.
But that's funny. Their kids are still doing it.
They
That's
actually
funny.
are. And, you know, I'd say to them, you know, some of the most fun games are on the Switch, and they'll just look at me as if I've just said, you know, why don't you go and buy a little baby's toy or something? I'm like, no, always trust Nintendo.
It's like, so it's almost as if you were going to say like, well, I like Fisher Price a lot, you know, and I like Duplo Legos. Those are kind of great.
Could I interest you in Mattel?
Yeah, man, it's just so funny. That's the way that's gone. Continuing on with like the bit wars, it's interesting. When I first kind of came up with the idea to do this episode, I focused on the 16-bit era, and again, my experiences with it, which were never contentious. Like no one got into fistfights over it, but it was always a debate, and there was always lines in the sand kind of drawn. But these wars never really stopped, right? They continued on through Xbox versus Sony, and even today with PC Master Race versus Xbox versus Sony. And these days, of course, with social media being so prevalent, it's very easy for these things to get nasty and ugly as opposed to just good-natured ribbing and back and forths. Why do you think that is? Why are we so attached to these companies, for lack of a better term?
I honestly don't know. And I mean, from a psychological standpoint, I guess maybe it's we're all so interested in sort of our setting stakes, being part of a tribe, I guess, for lack of a better term. You know, I mean, you see it in sports all the time. Like, how many people do you know who love professional sports who refer to, when they're talking about their favorite team and how they're doing, refer to them as we?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, we're going to be in the World Series this year. It's like, well, you're not going to be in the World Series this year, but I get what you're saying. You know, and I think there's an element of that. You know, and I mean, especially when you're younger, like now for me personally, and I've been like this probably since the 16-bit era, actually, although it wasn't right away. Like by the mid 90s, I had a Genesis and a Super Nintendo. But I was also in my late teens. So I had a job and I could buy these things if I saved up. But like when you're a kid and you've only really got one or the other, you kind of throw your loyalty behind that, right? And I think it comes from the same place that it did back in the 80s and 90s, where, you know, we're an NES family, we're a Super Nintendo family, we're a Genesis family, because that's what we got. And we made, you know, we sort of made our bed and we're going to lie in it. But I do think it's kind of funny, as I mentioned before, nowadays, like, and actually I should say with the Switch and Nintendo's been masterful at trading on nostalgia for 40 years.
Oh yeah.
Like nobody does it better.
No, you're right. Exactly.
You know, and they've sort of, I really respect what they've done, where they, and I feel like they were doing this in the late 90s actually, where they were still sort of doing the horsepower race, but it's like N64 was the beginning of where Nintendo kind of splintered off and sort of went down their own path, and then they went really crazy with like the Wii and the Wii U and the Switch, and for better or worse.
Sure.
But yeah, I find when we sort of check in for a podcast, of course, the three of us are all in our mid-40s, and every now and then we'll kind of check in and we'll talk about like these system wars, and I'll just roll our eyes. It's like I don't understand it at this point, when you, especially you've got Xbox and PlayStation sort of arguing with each other over it, because everything looks the same now. Whereas, you know, like back in and almost everything is on there now. You know, I mean, you know, Microsoft has their own games and Sony has their own games, so there is sort of that argument there. But it's again, it's not like it was before. It's like, you know, in the early 90s, if I had Alien 3 on my Genesis and you had Alien 3 on your Super Nintendo, they were two completely different games. So you could argue about that. Or if like I had Earthworm Jim on my Genesis and you had the Super Nintendo version, they were different enough that I could say like, here's all the things that I've got that you don't, you know, or Aladdin on both systems or stuff like that. Like they were wildly different games. And that doesn't happen anymore. So, you know, in hindsight, I look at it and say, it made more sense for us. Probably didn't, but I justified in my mind because of the fact that the end products were so different. But there was still an element of like, the Genesis is what my parents bought for me, so I'm a Genesis guy. No matter what happens, that's going to be the superior system.
And that's what you had, like you were saying. It's like this is who I have. And I think as you're talking about it, I'm kind of thinking through. I think a lot of when we were kids, we had more space for this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like there was less in our lives, so we had more space for this to take up pieces of our identity. I think it's all about identity. It's about ingesting these things as a person. But as we get older, of course, there's more things taking up our space. That's why as a 40-year-old man with two kids and a wife and a job, I can't care as much about PlayStation versus Xbox. Like I just can't.
Yeah.
There's no space in there for that. But I think what's happening now is that it's an identity thing. I think people are identifying with these brands, which in the end, these are just companies. These are just money-making organizations. It's really all they're there to do. I mean, they provide entertainment, but let's be honest, we should never identify or connect ourselves with corporations, you know.
And I think you make a really good point too. You're talking about you're 40, you know, and I'm in my mid 40s as well. And it's like, with the wisdom of age, we all realize that it's like, why am I fighting to defend Nintendo's honor? What, you know, Nintendo doesn't care about me.
No.
As long as I send them my money, they don't. That's it. That's the end of our relationship, you know.
The relationship is extremely transactional. That's all it is. It's like going to the grocery store. Like, you don't hear me in Texas here, don't me arguing Randall's versus HEB and getting into Twitter fights about it. Yeah. But there's something, again, about it still happens, though. Like, the bit wars have never stopped. It's like Fallout. War never changes. It's still kind of happening. And I always find it very interesting, you know, why, because I think in these days it's more intense too, because I have a whole other theory on why internet fighting is intense, right? Where on the playground it just wasn't.
It's much harder to be a complete dick to somebody face to face.
Yes.
Unless there's something sort of, I don't want to say mentally wrong with you, but you know what I mean? Like, unless you've got there's a personality issue, and you're just one of those people that's very aggressive and looks for a fight. You know, when you're face to face, it's much more obvious you're dealing with another human who has feelings, and maybe dial it back a little bit. Whereas on the internet, you're just shooting it out into the void,
right?
And you can afford to be a complete jerk.
Right, and also I think too with the shooting out into the void, and we're digressing a little bit into the world of the internet and Twitter and all that sort of thing. I spend most of my time online, social media on Twitter. That's just, I don't know, my platform of choice, I guess. And I think the shooting out is also because of that anonymity is a big part of it, because it is. But also I think people are just frustrated in general and need something to be angry at. That doesn't matter as much, but can? I don't know, it's so interesting to why that happens.
I think you have a really good point, actually. Life is a lot more complicated than it was 30 years ago. Yeah,
and life's a lot more difficult. And if you can't complain to your congressperson, you can't yell at your HOA for fining you for your grass. I'm just looking at my grass right now. It's insane. I gotta I can't do any of that, but I can.
But I can yell at you for liking Xbox games.
Yes, exactly. I can it's really, really crazy. I can yell at the screen because someone was hired to be Mario in a Mario movie. And it's like, no, you stink. How could you not be the? It's interesting. My main theory on a lot of this stuff is the difference between opinions, beliefs, and convictions. Mm-hmm. There's a hierarchy. Our opinions are kind of just the little things that flavor our lives. Like I like pepperoni pizza, the color blue, whatever. Yeah. Those are opinions, and they're great. Everyone has them, and they're not debatable because they're just what you like, which is great. Beliefs are the things that define you as a person, right? So that includes like a political stance or how you feel on certain issues, social issues, the things that actually make you, right? Mm-hmm. And those are the things you will feel like you have to debate. Again, they're hard to change because they're part of you, but you'll debate them. And then there's convictions. And convictions are the things that you will die for. Yeah. They're the things you'll take a bullet in the head for. And there should only be like 2 of those. You can have 100 opinions, maybe 10 or 15 beliefs, and then like 2 convictions. And that could be like, again, country, if you're a soldier, or family, or faith, or the biggies. Right. And our problem is all of our opinions are elevated to beliefs, and our beliefs are elevated to convictions.
That's a good way to describe it.
That's just what's happened. That's why you'll get into an argument about somebody who says, I kind of liked The Last Jedi. And they're like, screw you, Empire was best. Because those opinions have become beliefs. So if someone attacks that opinion that's now a belief, they're attacking you as a person.
Every opinion has become a hill.
Everything is a hill. Exactly. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Every opinion is now a hill to die on. And that is why I think it's just become this big cloud of angry discourse, which is tough. It's the wars have gotten smaller maybe, but they've gotten more vocal and they've gotten way more intense. Yeah. And so, like all wars, the battle of bits and bytes grew from a combination of varying sources. Kids being competitive, companies fighting for market share, and everyday people needing something to care about. Life is hard, often cruel, and we can't fight every enemy that comes our way. But instead of running to the easiest target, whether that's the Xbox kid in the playground or the Sony fan online, and start blasting away, we should instead embrace them as fellow gamers. And arm in arm, hand in hand, turn to the bigger targets we can only conquer together. But we won't. Because war never changes.